My name is Hartin. I always live by this rule of give a man a program, you'll frustrate him for a day. Teach a man a program, you'll frustrate him for a lifetime. I've been doing development for, gosh, almost 20 years now. My real name, which you'll probably see on LinkedIn and all that fun stuff, is Chester, though 9 out of 10 times I go by Chet, but feel free to call me whatever. Usually I'll respond. I often get Chaz, Chad, whatever. So I'm a technical architect at Concurrency, and I've been associated with Chicago Code Camp for, I think this is my 5th year now. You can find me at Twitter, on the web at my website, which is horribly outdated, and my Git. Let's see, my interest, I like to play music. You can probably see a couple of the instruments back behind me. Programming and writing. So serverless, right? So, you may realize that, servers are kind of the way of the past where, the more and more I get away from servers, the more and more I enjoy programming because I don't have to think about all the overhead. So I know this topic is kind of a big one. So let's talk about just focus on like serverless for enterprise. What does it give me? What do I like? What do I hate? And hopefully, part of this discussion will hopefully grow into something bigger, like where can I use serverless technology? Why do I, what are the benefits? So first off, like all web technology, we want to make sure it's, secure and compliant. We want to be able to scale up and out. We want to have great insights. We want to be able to be hybrid, like in multi-cloud, we want to be able to deploy on AWS or Google or Azure. And also serverless also gives us the ability to, not have any infrastructure. So we'll still have DevOps part of the pipeline, especially for CI/CD, but essentially, I don't have to log in and update a server, and I don't have to figure out oh, how many servers do I need, But one thing I really love about this is ultimately I have no wasted resources. If no one goes or if my serverless application never fires, I never have to pay for it. So that's great. And what's nice about it is what I do pay for is microbilling. So if I only have 10,000 people on my site, roughly, we can do the calculations, but 10,000 people on a site with say 5 actions, at most I'm paying $2 a month. So it's unbelievably cheap. So let's talk a little bit about fix versus need. So in serverless today, we'll talk a little bit about this later on, especially as we talk about how do I scale out or how do I estimate how much money I need to spend. So we've probably been used to VMs by now. I know, I've got several that I'm still using because there are still some things that, VMs can do. But essentially, I have a fixed amount of CPU. I have a fixed amount of RAM in the traditional model. Now in serverless, it's on-demand CPU and on-demand RAM. So essentially, I can easily scale up and scale out. Now, of course, the 3 big guns in the industry, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, all have their own serverless offerings. So in Microsoft Azure, you'll get, functions, logic apps, and containers. AWS, you'll also get Lambda and Fargate. And Google, you'll get, Cloud Functions and Cloud Run. Now, a lot of these, you'll find as you go into it, there's just small nuances between the two. But essentially, ultimately, the same goal, is going to be hit. I need just a little piece of code that I'm going to run over and over again. I need scale out, scale in as I need. So today, I hate to admit it, but I'm pretty vetted in the Azure stack. So I'll be talking about primarily Azure Logic Apps and Azure Functions and kind of compare, contrast, tell you about what I like about them, what I don't, And also I've got quite a few pro tips. So as you get into this, you'll notice that like, hey, this wasn't quite functioning the way I want it to, or how can I document this in a way that an experienced developer should document this? All that fun stuff. So logic apps, right? I kind of think of this as the Legos of programming. So we basically put together, a visual design workflow. So we've probably worked with workflows either through decisions or through, SharePoint, or, we're probably used to the concept of like workflows. And the nice thing about this is it's a minimum code solution. So sometimes you might have to write some code, but ultimately you really don't have to write much. Essentially, it's almost a drag and drop interface. The nice thing about this is, you can combine all these different functions and APIs together to essentially get like one nice workflow that you can, deploy in Azure. You can tweak, you can have different versions, you can see the history, like when was this last run. But what's nice is out of the box, there's over 200 connectors from various cloud services. So if you need a connection, to Azure SQL, great, no problem. Service Bus, no problem. AWS, no problem. Salesforce, no problem. So the nice thing is you've got all that just completely right out of the box without having to write your own connectors. Now, granted, if you have your own APIs that you want to bring into it, great. You can either call based on, like if it's a normal JSON REST endpoint, they've got you covered right out of the bat. But, if you've got like a SOAP connector or something like that, you can write your own connector from scratch, which is great. So let's talk about the different parts of a logic app. So there's 4 main parts. One is the connector. So where am I getting information to or sending it to? Triggers, which are basically the thing that start the process. Conditions, we should know this from all, development. These are, just like our standard conditions, like for loops or if, else, and then we've got actions, like things to do. So, like I was saying, our connectors that we were given out of the box, we've got well over 200. We've got built-in, we've got on-premise, we've got managed. We can use B2B, we can do B2C even. So the thing is, we can basically pick out of any connectors from Azure and say, hey, I want to connect to ACT, or I want to connect to Amazon SQS. Now, a connector is interesting because it actually has 2 parts to it. It's got the action, and then it's also got the triggers. So the actions are, kind of like, what am I doing? It includes like the retry policies, invoking services, and basically, it also contains like the conditions, our for loops, or, control. Then we have our triggers, which basically are, what kicks off the thing, or what do I do when I get information back? Now, much like all, varieties of code, we can write our own push triggers, we can write our own polling triggers, but there's also several of these, out of the box. We're also given, things like webhooks, so, we can only use it when we need to. So here's a quick visualization of a connector. So I pulled out 2 popular ones that I use quite a bit. The first one being Twitter and also Dropbox. So, the trigger that, we're given out of the box for Twitter is like when a new tweet is posted. Now, granted, there's also kind of like this could be, whenever, I post something, I want I want that to be a trigger, or I can, focus in on a hashtag. I can, essentially say, oh, okay, whenever X, Y, or Z is trending. And then I've got actions, right? So, like, if I want to figure out who is, like say I get a disparaging tweet towards me, which never happens, right? Like essentially I can figure out like, oh, is this a troll or is this a real person? So like I can get their followers, and I can also like dig down deep to see like, oh, okay, do analytics on that later on down the workflow to see like, oh, they're just a troll. Great. Vice versa, like on Dropbox, whenever a file is created or modified, I can trigger off of that. So say if I had a CSV file or, something that I use in my line of business, I can essentially have that Dropbox, connector that watches that file or a folder or anything like that. So this is great, especially like say if I have a publishing company and I need to basically say, tie that into like PayPal or something to that degree and say, oh, Chet just paid for this file for this, to get this EPUB, he needs to have access. So I can, integrate with PayPal, I can integrate with Dropbox, and then I can integrate with like Mail to essentially say, oh, well, send Chet the link to tell him that, he's now got access to the EPUB. So there's a couple different types of triggers. We've kind of touched on this briefly, but there's polling triggers, push triggers, recurrence triggers, and manual triggers. And these are essentially what they are. So polling, basically every n amount of time we look at an external service, see, if we've got new data. If not, no problem. If so, great. We'll start the workflow with that. For a push trigger, these are some of my favorites because like essentially I get the information ASAP. I don't have to wait on some kind of a poll. Now, granted, how many of us have written cron jobs in our life? I've written a ton of them. And that's basically what the recurrence trigger is. So essentially saying every day at 1 a.m. These are great for backups. These are great for, any kind of daily function or, second millisecond function if we really wanted to. And then we've got manual triggers. So these are things that we can call from like our phones or web apps or anything like that. Basically say, oh, this thing happened now. So manually trigger it. So flow, we've talked about this a little bit before, right? So these are our conditions. So out of the box, Logic Apps gives us, traditional if else. It also gives us, multiple if else. We've got switches, we've got for each loops and until loops, which is great for like dealing with a whole lot of data. Say you've got a, CSV file or a JSON file that has lots and lots of lists in it, comes in really, really handy there. So here are some of our program-friendly types and operators. So most computer science, we've got, numbers, we've got strings, we've got booleans, but we've also got JSON objects. So if you've never worked with JSON, it's fantastic. It's almost life-changing, but it's become, like a default standard on the web to send and retrieve information. So out of the box, I won't read these off, but essentially this is a nice handy guide to have, like to figure out like, oh, I've got this kind of data that I can work with in my Logic Apps. So let's do a walkthrough. So one of the things I've had to build several times is basically a social media monitor. So, we could tie this into Instagram or Twitter or anything like that. And I don't know if you've ever really worked with cognitive services, but there's this great function in there, which is detect sentiment. So like, is this a happy thing or an angry thing or a sad thing? So I know I've had to work with lots of companies to basically say, oh, okay, are we, someone just tweeted about our product. Do they love it or do they hate it? And oftentimes, like I know myself, I usually only tweet about something if I really am mad about it. So, this is a great thing about like detect sentiment, like, oh, my flight hasn't taken off in like 3 hours. Thanks, United. So essentially, here's kind of the scenario that we're going to play with, which is basically having a trigger. If it's a happy tweet, great. We'll throw it in the SQL database. If it's an angry tweet, we'll send it to email because essentially, my manager needs to hear about this right now. All right, so let's walk through this, right? So from scratch, what we're going to do is just hit, I'm in, my Azure Portal and click Add, Logic App, hit Create, and we'll call this LA Chicago Code Camp 09/2020. East is okay. I'll go ahead and, no log analytics today. I could create tags if I really want to. I know some of our companies love if we tag things, but this is on my personal account, so I'm not too worried about it. All right, so this will take a few minutes, but if anyone has any questions so far, please type it into the group chat, and I'll try it. You'll see my eyes going over here to the second screen, so I'll be watching that occasionally. As you can tell, we've got our resource up and ready to go already, so great. So you'll see out of the box, I've got a couple different common triggers I can start with. So, if a file is updated to FTP, when something is created new on OneDrive, when I receive an email, I've got my recurrence, I've got service bus, event grid, you name it. So since I said we're going to do when a new tweet is posted, let's hit that. And you'll see I've already got a connection set up. So pretty much what I'm going to do is, you can see in here that like essentially I can search for a term, I can look from a username, I can do a hashtag. So any suggestions on what hashtag we should take a look at today? We could do Chicago Code Camp.
Yeah, Chicago Code Camp. Tech event, or CCC tech event.
All right, CCC tech event. Awesome. See, time zone, I don't care. Now I'll create the next step, right? And so what I want to do is text analytics. So I'll click that, it was already there. And one thing I want to do is detect sentiment. So you can see I've got, here are my triggers, here are my actions. So on actions, I can see I detect entities, detect language, detect sentiment, key phrases, all that fun stuff. So I'm going to just do sentiment. And I'm going to do text because essentially I want to, look at the Twitter text to see, oh, is this happy, sad, angry? So I'll go ahead and say I'm going to look at tweet text. Great. Then after that, I need to figure out, is this happy? Is this sad? So what I want to do is look in for a condition, or, as it's in called in Logic Apps, control. So essentially, here are my controls that I can do. So I can do an until, I can do terminate, switch, scope. And I'll talk a little bit about scope a little later on. It's actually really cool. But right now, I'll just do condition. So you'll see that, these are outputs, right, throughout here. So in conditions, so I can basically say, I want an end condition, and I can link a lot of these together. So say if I was dealing with a little more complex data, like I could check to see if subject is empty and user isn't test and blah, blah, blah. But right now, I'm just going to look at score, and you'll see that it tells me that this is a decimal number between 0 and 1. So the closer I get to 0, the angrier I am. And the closer I get to 1, the happier I am. So let's go score. And I'm going to say this is greater or equal to, greater than or equal to, and I'll say 0.7 because that usually, if it's usually 0.7 or above, we know that the solution is usually pretty happy, right? All right, so looking at, my true condition, so if it is over than 7, it'll go over here to the true column. I'll also go to the false column. And I can also do like a new step in there whenever those two end. But essentially, going back to my diagram, basically, if I'm happy, I want to insert a row. And if it's sad, I want to send an email. So let's go back over here. So, I can look for any connector I want, but, essentially SQL is here. So I'll go great. I want to insert a row. I've already got my connections set up, so that's great. Got my table name set up, so that's awesome. So now I need to find like what my Twitter handle is, like who tweeted me. So I can select tweeted by. Then I can also say tweeted text over here. And that's essentially all I have to do to like insert a row. I don't have to write a lick of SQL so long as my table already exists. Now look how easy it is to send an email, right? So I've already got an Office 365 account, but like essentially, I could also integrate with Gmail or, SendGrid or anything to that degree. But I'll just use Office 365. And I want to do send. So I can send an email from shared mailbox, an approval email, blah, blah, blah. I'll just send an email. And let's say I want to send this to my Gmail account. So, because, I want to hear all the complaints directly. Now, one thing that's cool here is I can choose what I want to go here to subject, right? So I can say angry user, bad score. And then what I can go over here is in sentiment, I can like drop and score right there. All right, and so for the body, what I can do is I want to see the tweet body, right? I want to be able to see the user details, and I also want to see the angry tweet. All right, so with just 0 lines of code, I've got a fully functioning app right here that I can go ahead and say save. And basically, I'm running, I'm live. So then if you want to send a happy or an angry tweet, you can do that, or I can also do that from over here. All right, great.
And you guys in the audience, now would be a good time if you guys have any questions, or you can heckle him on Twitter right now.
Yeah, these works too. So we can look back into our what happened, right? So this says, oh, there was a tweet that says, hey, watching Hartin present at Chicago Code Camp. Thanks for presenting. Awesome. Now I can go through here. Let's see what the sentiment score was. Ooh, awesome. 0.98. That's great. Now over here, I've got the inserted row from I am in mom. And then if I really wanted to, I can go over here and look, I've got all that data here in the database. So I've got an ID, I've got the Twitter handle, and I've got Twitter detail. So with just an insane lack of code, I was able to go from idea all the way up to, all the way up through the end, so I've got this stored in the database. So, happy customer, right? All right, so let's talk about some other real world examples that we've come across. So in my lifespan now, probably within the last 4 or 5 years, I've built probably 30 some odd, logic apps for customers. And, oftentimes they vary so differently as far as what the customer wants. But oftentimes, even though I love programming in C#, I wouldn't give it up for the world. If I need to throw out some quick code really quick that like integrates all these different things together into a workflow, and I don't have to write a lick of code, sweet. So like in this one, this was a piece of code that I wrote for my own blog. So like anytime I create a new post, on that blog, which it's been a while, essentially I create a short link for Twitter and LinkedIn, and I post those to LinkedIn, And I also send myself an email, so I could say, oh, basically make sure that like the links are working and all that fun stuff. So, this is something, and I've also, built this out for clients as well. And, we're working on a new Chicago Code campsite that this is going to be part of too. So, like essentially when we have a new event, it automatically posts it. So, it will save John, quite a bit of work so he doesn't have to think, oh, okay, wait, I need to send this out ASAP. It will take care of that immediately. All right, here's another real world example. So how much junk email do we get, right? I get a ton. And it'd be nice for me to figure out, like, is this like, now Gmail and Outlook do a great job. But sometimes, especially if work contacts me about something that I think, might be serious, oftentimes I want it to be flagged or sent to my cell phone or something like that. And especially, like if my manager, emails me and I'm not, or like calls me, or like emails me with like an urgent flag, I want to make sure, oh my gosh. So here's something that was built out for a client for basically figuring out like, is this, thing, an order, like essentially they had this scenario of like, oh, I've got this, I would like to buy this part, and it came in by an email. So, we worked with our, AI team for, to create like a natural language processor unit to figure out like, hey, is this, does this look like a part? Does this look like a sales email? We're able to process it utilizing, Azure Functions and NLP and, kind of a complex scenario, to basically say, oh, at the end of the day, I want to flag this as a sale, so that like essentially, we can hop on it immediately. And that was a really fun project. Other real world applications I've built in the past is essentially like detecting when a new SQL record is inserted into the database. So what's nice about like the Azure World Sphere is like if you're using one Microsoft tool, it integrates well with all the other Microsoft tools. So, we can tell like when new rows are inserted, we can like figure out like when an event has happened, like say if we've got, application insights and it determines that like our server is down, like we can immediately act on that. We can run JavaScript code like on the fly. So like essentially if there's some node project or something to that degree, voila. So next up is like, uploading files from a URL. So, sometimes we want to make sure that there's, like a workflow. So I don't want to just upload a file. I want to inspect it like through, I want to run virus scan on it first, and then I want to be able to check and make sure that everything is working right. Or like, our simple post over here, we can monitor and archive social media posts. All right. So one thing that, we can talk about is how do I test a logic app? If I'm building good software, what can I do to test this? In short, logic apps are kind of interesting to test. Like they allow you to mock some results with static results. So essentially I can go in there and say, oh, for this, I'm expecting data to look back like this from my result and just test, pass and fail, that way. But essentially, one of the major disads about testing logic apps is it's mostly manual testing. So testing to see, like just emailing myself over and over again to see if I can get this, like, did it work the way I want it to, So one of the big disadvantages of logic apps is it is mostly manual testing. Now, in the Azure sphere, it's pretty easy to secure logic apps. So, if we do have the trigger that goes off of HTTP request, this is going to be a publicly exposed endpoint. Now, we can make sure that it comes through HTTPS, and we can also make sure that you pass an SAS token, so that essentially I can only call this endpoint if I am, have a token and call it securely. But what's nice about this, you can think of it like any other Azure application. Essentially, we can lock it down to IP access controls. So essentially, instead of any IP address, if we can specify ranges, we can also put this behind Azure API management. So essentially, there's only going to be one input and output to it. Or I can also lock this down with AAD, which we're planning to do for Chicago Code Camp, new site. And essentially, or we could do basic or OAuth too. So essentially, if we didn't want to use AAD, we still have basic auth and OAuth, in our back pocket. So those are just a couple of the quick ways that, you can secure it. Now, deploying logic apps is another kind of hit for logic apps. You can use ARM templates, which are pretty straightforward. It's a little mix of PowerShell and, kind of magical variables dipped in. We can use Terraform, which I've had quite a bit of luck with. And then we've got a secondary method, which I call copy paste pray, where basically you go to your code behind, copy it to a new one, and then essentially make a couple different changes to it. But essentially, it's a little ugly because essentially if I have anything that is tied to a user or a service bus or something to that degree, essentially I have to recreate those connections from scratch. And sometimes that works great, sometimes it doesn't. So, my rule of thumb is, if you can build this in prod, great. But oftentimes as developers, we can't build in prod and we need to have a way that we can replicate this per environment. So dev, UAT, QA, prod, and that's essentially where Terraform and ARM templates come in. You can add in variables, which is great, but essentially sometimes things will get hairy. I wish it was a little easier, deploying any kind of C# application or Node application, and you could just point to a config file, but it's a little ugly. I'm going, I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and I haven't found the easiest route yet, unless it's a very simple workflow. All right, so here are some things that I've come across that I'm going to say are pro tips. The thing is, you need to use descriptive names. There's not an easy way to rename a logic app. Essentially, one way that you can do is clone it as a new name, but essentially that becomes a pain in the rear, especially if you've already got this out in production. Also, you can't rename actions that have dependencies. So essentially, if I'm already using Twitter and I didn't rename it to something else, I want to give it a friendlier name, I can't rename it easily if I've already got dependencies on it. Now, granted, I can go into the code behind and say, let's take a look over here. I can go back over here. I can look at the code behind, and essentially I can rename it here by finding and replacing, which works. But, essentially sometimes, if I wanted to change tweet text to something else and I did a bad find and replace, now essentially my logic app is broken, which makes everyone sad. Okay, other pro tips. We can actually use comments in logic apps. And it's actually quite easy to do that. So oftentimes I'll find myself why did I do this? What was the reason for this condition? Now it's super easy to add a comment. So just click on the little ellipses, add comment, and then I can essentially say, I'm checking for score greater than 0.7. 0.7 if I could type today. And now I know next time I look at this code, if I wanted to say, oh, why did I have this condition, or what does this condition do? Now I have documentation. So, it makes me feel like a real developer again. Now I did mention scopes earlier. Now a scope allows me to put actions together. and we can kind of think of these as regions in .NET code, but we can essentially put all these units together, and have it act like a try-catch finally. So granted, if I call Azure Functions or a third-party API, there's no guarantee that will always work. I might have caught it at a bad time. I might have found out, oh, geez, something went terribly wrong. And if I don't wrap this, essentially my logic app can fail horribly, and I may or may not know that it ever failed. So I definitely am a huge fan of using scopes for that reason. So other things, we can also do this thing called run after for error handling. And this is really nice function too. So essentially after this, if I wanted, some of the built-ins don't have configure run after, some of them do. But essentially, I can do specialized things to say, oh, if it did fail, log it, or if it did do something else, I can do more or less, graceful error handling, which is fantastic. Also, one thing I always like to do is, implement defensive code. We don't know what's going to come in, especially if we're running a post. So essentially, make sure that, when you're checking your steps in your workflow, think of it like you're actually doing, C# code or, JavaScript code. How would I check this? Am I looking to see if this is, good input? Am I checking to see if this is good output? Also, there's this great functionality as far as like controlling your connectors. Now, you'll see over here in this logic, let me go ahead and say okay there. Go to here. You'll see that like a lot of the things, you'll see I've got different connections, right? Like SQL, SQL 2, Office 365, Twitter. Sometimes they're friendly names, sometimes they're not, right? But essentially, over time, I can get a lot of these, especially if I'm just trying things out. So one thing to do that I like to do is essentially remove orphan connectors. So if you work on this link, and I'll put this up in my GitHub, but essentially there's this great way to find, do I have any orphaned connectors out there, right? Because oftentimes they'll just be sitting out there and it's like, I don't know what that was for. Service bus, I don't even have a service bus anymore. All right, so let's talk about some of the pros and cons. Nice thing is the execution scales with my apps automatically. So if I have 10,000 tweets hit me at once, great. I can handle it. I can scale up without writing any code. I can process giant data sets in parallel. So essentially if I'm doing, giant batch jobs, this is great for it because I can just go ahead and do kind of a fan out architecture pattern and have everything do its own little bits and then come back together at the end of the workflow. Now, one big con about Logic Apps is there's no real guarantee for activation. So even if I'm, watching a blob or listening to, a queue, it doesn't mean that this will ultimately fire, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will fire like within milliseconds. So I wouldn't use this for like, a stock watcher app, to say, how's Apple doing today or Microsoft doing? Another thing is it doesn't enforce real-time constraints on execution time. So essentially, if something normally takes, 0.2 milliseconds and all of a sudden, it now takes 30 minutes, it's not going to complain so long as it gets a success back. So, that's kind of, a little bit of a smell when it comes to like, oh, I need this to be mission critical. It won't necessarily get you up to mission critical response. How much does it cost? It is dirt cheap. So like for actions and connectors, we're talking about fractions of a cent. So say, if I had one connector that had like 5 sub actions and it's called, 10,000 times in a month, essentially I'm out of pocket up $2.25. So for, if you try to even run the cheapest, basic Microsoft Web API out there through like a standard C# plan, you're going to be out $10, and who knows if anyone's going to use it, right? So, for the money, this is great. Okay, so here's a handy dandy guidance chart of like when to use. So essentially, if I don't need to integrate multiple apps or systems, this might be overkill, right? If I need real-time performance, it's definitely overkill. It's not going to work for you. And unfortunately, some clients will be tell you like, oh no, we need this to be mission critical, and oftentimes it's kind of like, we can do it this way, or we can spend thousands of dollars, to get that millisecond response time. So is it complex? Are you using pre-built connectors? So essentially, you can follow this guidance chart to figure out like, is this a good idea? Is this not a good idea for logic apps? As anything, never spend 6 minutes doing something by hand when you can spend 6 hours automating it. And oftentimes, sometimes it doesn't work too well. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about Azure Functions. So what are the differences? So logic apps run a workflow. It's only got a visual designer. So I'm locked into basically like that JSON editor, or like through the Lego drag and drop kind of interface. Now Azure Functions, ultimately execute a piece of code. Now they support multiple languages. So if you're a C# developer, or Java developer, Node developer, you can write in your own natural language. You don't have to, think about like, okay, here are these specialized blocks and I need to kind of tweak this, with this specialized kind of if-else code, But the bad thing about Azure Functions is you only got a minimum number of connectors available to you. So the basic rules for functions are they need to be stateless, right? So stateless means I can't remember who you are. I can't remember what happened before this. Ultimately, functions shouldn't call other functions. I put an asterisk there because there are patterns out there that allow you to call, other functions. But usually when a function calls another function, you need to have like output, right? But ultimately, at the end of the day, a function should only do one thing. So if your function is, jumping through 30 hoops, you've kind of got too many things on that function. Now, ultimately, for functions, you want them to execute in less than a second, ideally. Now, granted, they won't time out on most plans for 2.5 minutes. And if you get the premium plan, they won't time out, like essentially, I think for up to an hour, but you can edit that. But ultimately, the rule of thumb is functions should only do one thing. Now, functions parallel logic apps quite a bit because you've got an event, right? So you've got a timer, HTTP thing, you've got a blob, storage, blah, blah, blah. So there's still going to be kind of a triggering event, right? Then you've got your actual code, which, you can write in your own language. And then you've got outputs, which you could basically take whatever your original, result is, like stored into blob, put it on a queue, stored in Cosmos DB, throw it on event grid. So let's talk a little bit about triggers. This is exactly like triggers in logic apps. So they cause the function to run, and you can only have exactly one trigger. You've got associated data, so it could be like a JSON body. It can be, a stream data from a blob. It can be, some kind of information that you're getting from a third party trigger that it supports. But essentially, triggers for this are going to be fairly minimal and fairly basic. Now, binding is basically an input or an output. So I can bind to, a storage blob, or I can bind to a CSV file, or I can bind to like an output. So I'm going to dump all of my results from this CSV file that I'm turning to a JSON over here. And essentially, I'm going to use these, much like a parameter, like in our functions. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Now, as far as today, the current triggers and bindings that I can use in functions are quite a there's maybe about 20. So I can use like Microsoft Graph, I can use Excel tables, I can use, auth tokens, I can use hubs, I can use SignalR, which is great. But essentially, it's a really reduced list, right? And only some of them I can use as a trigger, only some of them I can use as inputs, some of them I can use as outputs. And the thing is, as functions become a little more mature, we're getting more and more options all the time, but we're still kind of limited. I find myself wanting to write a function for things and thinking, oh gosh, it's not supported yet, so functions aren't really going to work here. Maybe logic apps will, and then I can pass that to the function. So functions have two parts. So you've got function JSON, which basically defines my triggers, my input and my output. And then I've got run, and this is for C# CSX. So essentially, you can see here, as far as one, I've got my trigger, my input, my actual code, and then my output. So let's do a quick walkthrough with just hello world functionality. So we'll go ahead, we'll get into Azure Portal, and let's select function app. We'll do something real basic. We'll give it a name like LA Code Camp 09-2020, and that's free. Great. I'll pick a runtime stack, so you'll see I've got a couple different ones I can choose from. I'll do .NET Core because that's my favorite language. Choose a region. Sure, East. For hosting, I'll just create a, we'll create a new storage account from scratch. We'll use Windows. As far as plan type, I can either go serverless, which basically means I'm only paying for what I'm using. Premium, which gives me a couple more options like long-running functions, but essentially there's a price involved, or an app service plan. For today, I'll just use consumption. I'll review and create. And this is actually quite fast that these are deployed. Any other questions so far? While this is deploying.
I don't see any yet, chat.
All right, great.
But folks, feel free to write in the chat room for now until the end of the event, and then we'll open up the muting. We'll unmute everyone at that point.
All right, looks like it's almost done.
So chat, I got a silly question here. Which one do you like better, Logic Apps or Azure Functions?
Ultimately, I would say I can do a lot more in Azure Functions, but I love the workflow aspect of Logic Apps. So oftentimes, when you have a complex scenario, I do a mix and match of both Logic Apps and Functions, because essentially I want to be able to write a lot of nitty-gritty code, especially for clients that have like very specialized needs. But I would say I love like all the connectors that Logic Apps give me out of the blue. Mm-hmm. So, it's hard to say. I would say at the end of the day, I'm still a huge fan of Functions because I can put together durable functions if I need a workflow scenario. But I do, miss the connections in that.
Yeah. I mean, I love the connectors aspect, right? With Twitter and everything else. I mean, not just Twitter, but there's all this other stuff like, Office integrations, everything out there. And the flow is great, as you mentioned, but it's one of those interesting cases where, you got to get the right balance.
Right. And if you're working with an Office, like someone who's like drank from the fountain of Office 365 and, Outlook and all that, these tools make it super easy.
Yeah.
All right, so now we've got our function deployed.
Hey, Chad, real quick.
Yeah.
I think Overgal said, best is combination of both. And then I think Gordana Sekic is there a monitoring ability out of the box enabled for the logic apps?
Yes, there is out of the box, and I'll walk through that here shortly. And yeah, Offergal, I totally agree. Best combination is both. So let's go ahead and just create a simple function. I know we've kind of created the body, or like kind of like the host of the function, but the host basically can hold as many functions inside it as we want. So to create one, I can either create one locally through Visual Studio or VS Code, but for ease sake, I'll just go ahead and create one in the cloud. Now, when I click on add, you can see that I've got timer triggers, I've got HTTP triggers. I can, queue off of storage, blobs, event grids, and signal R. So, this gives me a lot of things off the bat. But for our demo, we'll just talk about an HTTP trigger. And this is kind of an example of what we're doing with the new CodeCamp site once it finally launches. So I'll give it a name. So we'll just call this test trigger. For my authorization level, I can have it be anonymous, which means I won't have to hook anything in as far as like a token. I can just free for all, or I can have a function level where basically I get a token that I have to pass in either in the header or in the query string. So I'll lock this down for now, and I'll say create function. All right, and you can see just out of the box, I've got some basic, monitoring, so I can get my count, how many times was it executed, how many times did it fail. So this looks a whole lot like application insights. Now, if I want to actually go into the code and see what's going on there, you'll see that this looks a lot like C# because it is C#. You'll see that I've got run.csx. I've also got function.json. Function.json tells me like my inputs and outputs. Right now, this allows me to say, oh, I'm going to have both a get and post method here. So I can accept both. And then I will return something called return with a $sign, which is going to be HTTP. Now let's look back at my code, see what that's doing. So I've got logging, which is great. Oh, it looks like I'm looking for a query string called name. I can also look at the body if I'm doing a post, and then essentially run here. So how do I test and run this? I can either go here and try it as a post, and I'll say I'm going to use my default function key. You'll see it as Azure, and it'll say, oh, but what's nice too is I can actually go copy this and open up a tool like Postman. And my query string was name, so name, Chet. And you'll see that I actually get a response back. Now this isn't quite a JSON response, but at least it gives me like my standard 200 message or anything to that degree. I can also run that as a post if I wanted to in its current configuration. And what's nice is this out of the box, I can do anything to this code. Like if I just want to throw out anything in my request and just say, oh, I just want to always respond back something like hello code camp. Test that. And it might be helpful if I save. And I get back a response, hello code camp. Now let's talk about like my monitoring on that. No results yet since it's still kind of fresh, but I bet I can go over here and see some quick responses. So you can tell that I've got no errors, but I've actually executed this a time or two. So that's pretty easy, right? Like essentially I was able to write an API from scratch without really doing much. I don't have to worry about I didn't really have to worry about how many servers is this running on or anything to that degree. It's just ready to go. So here are some real world examples I've come across. The first thing is oftentimes, I've got CSV files that I need to either turn this into JSON or I need to turn this into a storage table. And so some of the scenarios I've run through, is essentially I need to take the CSV and create a Power BI chart or graphic. So essentially someone in the business office can upload the latest numbers into a Azure storage blob and it magically takes care of itself and updates the website, so they've got the freshest data on Power BI. So you can slice and dice as you want. Other things, this is great, like image scaling. I've done this for pet websites. I've done this for social media websites, but essentially, you want to have current, a good scaling pattern. So essentially, if a giant photo comes in, but I want to make sure that it looks great on my website or make a thumbnail, essentially I can automatically scale this out, using a lot of different tools. And essentially going back to the principles of functions should have only one job. Great, it listens to a blob storage, shrinks it, outputs it. Other things are custom pages. In the modern world, we definitely want to have websites that know me, or that can essentially do a target-based advertisement on me. So essentially when we call, say if I have a React site that's doing something or another, and I want to marry in special targeted ads for me, essentially I've done this in the past where, you create a special webhook, says, oh, this is Chet who's on this page. Chet really likes, advertisements about grills. So here's a grill, that ultimately comes out on the completed page. So that function is really nice. It just dishes up very specific, specific words, but very detailed information just for me that only I will see versus, if say, Gordana went to a site or Min went to a site. Other things like structured data. So for IoT, we get all kinds of crazy information from all kinds of different products, but essentially we need to turn that into somewhat structured data sometimes, so we can basically say, oh, what is the name of the device, where is it deployed to, and what's the problem? So essentially I can take in all those kinds of crazy streams of data from all my IoT devices and just simplify it through Azure Functions and dump it into a SQL database, or throw it on Power BI. So here's a fun question. Can functions call other functions? Technically, yes, but ultimately this can be bad practice, because we can lose state. We can, we don't have good error handling. So if it, errors out, what can I do? But there is a special kind of function that, allows us to have, continued state, and these are called durable functions. And they can handle all these crazy scenarios of oh, do all these different workflows, kind of like we saw in logic apps, as far as did this pass? If so, great, send it off over here. If not, blah, blah, blah. So essentially these are called, there's one specific specialized type of function called orchestrator functions, and they allow us to call all the additional functions, down the line. Now the caveat is that all the other sub-functions have to be another special type of function called entity functions. So these are a very specialized type of function, that can work with an orchestrator function to say, oh, do this, then that, and that, and that is a little bit more advanced for this talk, but definitely there is a practice out there, and I just want to give you all a heads up that those exist, and they're actually kind of neat. And there are all kinds of architectural patterns that you can utilize with those, like fan in, fan out, distributed models, all that fun stuff that we can use. Here are a couple of the durable function patterns that you can, look out for. I think there's, you can Google any of these. They're not specifically tailored for Azure. A lot of these architectural patterns you'll find, in AWS or just general standard practices. Now, here's the cool thing about Azure Functions. You can actually test them pretty well. You can use dependency injection really easily with Azure Functions because it's just code, right? So essentially, if I'm writing JavaScript, or Node or Python, essentially I've got all my standard testing tools available. So I can use unit tests, I can use mocks, I can use things such as curl, Postman, Swagger to test all my Azure functions. So from a testing perspective, I love this because here my DevOps and QA folks or myself, if I'm wearing that hat that day, I can build out like really good projects that I can say, yes, I know it will work under these scenarios and they'll fall under these scenarios, and we've got this handled. As far as security, what's nice is, we've got, HTTP and HTTPS. We can force these to be HTTPS if we want. We can, out of the box, we've got access keys that we can enable or disable. We've got basic scopes, out of the box as far as like, function keys, host keys. Do I want to tie down this function to a particular key? Can I generate more keys? Absolutely. I can also, like most websites, I can lock it down via CORS, right? So essentially any postback web callback that I need to develop, like I can restrict that down. But what's also great is I can also tie this down, through, Azure Active Directory. I can tie it down to like a Microsoft login, Facebook, Google, Twitter. Now the disad is, even though all these different things use, OAuth 2, unfortunately it doesn't give me OAuth 2 out of the box. So I can write my own handlers for that. But, unlike Logic Apps where I can get OAuth 2 out of the box, essentially this kind of locks me down to, a few different odds and ends. Like basically I'm locked down to this for authorization and authentication. All right. Now, other things that we can talk about as far as security for both Logic Apps in Functions is essentially that I can use the Azure world to like basically have things that follow my AAD. So I can automatically integrate into Event Hub, Service Hub, Storage Blobs, anything that uses Azure Services Managed Identities, I can use for both, Logic Apps and Functions, which is fantastic. So essentially, like if I have a service account that I need to lock down, automatically it goes there. Let's see, other things along the lines. Oh, this is a great pro tip that I've run into several times, sadly, that I've had to like write it down for myself, which is like for blob triggers. So essentially, like if I'm watching a blob, like under the consumption plan, like there can be up to a 10-minute delay. So essentially, if I upload an image onto a blob and I want to get it resized, it may not be instamatic. Like there might be a delay of like 10 minutes, which is interesting because like when you're debugging locally on your computer, it's almost instantaneously. But in prod, or like once you push it up to a server, you'll find that, oh, why hasn't this fired yet? Is it broken? So, just pro tip, that can happen. Now there are two ways to get around this that I've found. One thing is like you can switch from like a consumption plan to a pro plan, which, I can automatically say this is always enabled, or I can use an event grid as my trigger with my blob storage account, and that will fire automatically. All right, other ways in places I've used real world functions is like, say, oftentimes, I need to update my Azure Key Vault passwords, right? And this is kind of a manual task because like essentially if it's in Key Vault, I don't know it. But essentially one of the things I've done for clients and for myself is essentially like every month I've got a timer to go out, update my passwords in my Key Vault, and then essentially update those in my applications that use those. So essentially, go from there. I can also create, email subscriptions. So if I have a website and I want to go ahead and subscribe, like as a user, I want to subscribe to this, great. That's a great call for a single application function. I can also create, convert files from one type to another or run scheduled reports. All right, so on that note, that said, all this can be found out by Google, but it's also nice to get kind of like a quick, view into what can I use these for? Like, what are some real world scenarios that I can use that? All right, I know I am short on time, so I want to jump right into, does anyone have any questions for me? And we can unmute the mics.
Yep, I am about to unmute the mics right now. All right, everybody.
I know, looks like Gordana asked about out-of-the-box enabling for logic apps, which is a great question because I can.
He's muted.
Who's muted?
Chat.
Hey, chat, you are muted right now.
Okay.
Oops, I muted you again. Sorry, that's my fault this time.
All right. Sorry about that. I was talking about different ways that we can monitor logic apps right out of the box. And talking about the runs history and, essentially seeing what happened when. We can also use metrics and diagnostics and logs just right out of the box so we don't have to do anything too crazy. We can also integrate application insights if we wanted to, so we can get real nitty-gritty details, but I didn't do it in this example.
What would you say is like the biggest thing that, let's just say somebody's getting into logic apps, what's the biggest gotcha that, they should be aware of? Is it those connectors, like like as you're playing with them, like those connectors being like, lost, managing those things, is it like the first gotcha, or is there other ones that, that you would say is there?
I would say definitely if you're looking to deploy logic apps, that's going to be a giant gotcha right there. Other than that, ultimately when you're playing around, you're going to have all kinds of connections and uses, and you'll find out over time that your resource group is just littered with them. And so that's where, definitely scripts to find out orphaned connections are there, because essentially when you've got several connections that you don't recall because it's been several months down the road, and you're looking at, something like this and you're like, well, what is Office 365? What is SQL? SQL to what? You'll find out over time that, you have this littered, and it's nice to have like a quick PowerShell script that you can say, oh, find all the ones that are abandoned and delete them. Other gotchas that I found is cost, because sometimes, especially like, even though it's really low cost to run these over and over again. Essentially, sometimes I'll set up, things that fire every second, like on a timer, or say if I have it monitoring my email, like, every second, there's a lot of seconds in a month, so I've surprised myself with like bills of things that I really didn't need to have that kind of frequency. But, granted, they'll be like $8, but, it's kind of like $8 on a Logic app. That's pretty pricey.
Well, $8 versus, $50,000.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But I assume that, you can probably put like a Azure alerts or something like that on those cost things.
Oh, absolutely. And you can definitely, there are a lot of great ways to manage costs in Azure and shut things down, if they go over a bucket. But other gotchas is kind of like the language of a Logic app can be a little weird, especially if you ever have to manually modify anything. Or once you start getting into variables and all that fun stuff, you can definitely get into some really interesting scenarios that are hard to debug. What's nice is out of the box, it gives you versioning. So say if you did create like a big oops, you can step back a few histories and be able to, get your last working version.
Hey, I have a question. So this sounds like a major competitor to like a Zapier type service. How does it compare?
Good question. I don't know Zapier offhand. I know like other services like if then that
Mm-hmm.
is a good comparison. Which kind of utilizes the same kind of functionality. Like essentially you've got Lego blocks that you can combine, mix and match. I would say as far as, like essentially as a third-party developer, I can create like connectors for if then that. And you probably might be able to use a SDK for something like Zapier as well. But essentially, when it comes to like other third-party services, I would have to say like where they probably do quite a bit of overlap. So there's that nice Venn diagram in there as far as like this handles, like Alexa services work great and fantastic in if then that, but they might not necessarily work too well in Logic apps. There might not be a connector, or you might have like a connection, to like say, I know in if then that, like I've got like the ability to modify my shopping list on my iPhone, but I don't necessarily have that in Logic apps. Other than that, like there are some very specialized things. So like in Logic apps, like essentially you're having to tie it to just like a single account or a single connection. So you don't necessarily have like, say, I can't really provide this to like 10,000 different users as a connector, like not without like getting really specific, like doing some really interesting hacks. So that's kind of where like it's kind of not necessarily a broad deployable solution where like if then that, definitely scales out better in that degree, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
All right. Let's see, looking at the list.
Hey, Chad. I know this is kind of like a dear topic of yours. Any way to do like CI/CD on a Logic app?
Yes and no. Through ARM templates, you can do CI/CD. But if you have what gets interesting is like these connections, you can do CI/CD. But the thing is like essentially I'm still going to like for SQL that should be no problem. But other things like Twitter connections, like since you have to verify against the third-party API, sometimes you'll have to go in here, go into edit API connection, and then have to like even though you can script out this being created, It doesn't automatically give you authorization throughout the box. So if you're using a third-party thing like, say, Office 365 or Twitter or Facebook or something like that, you'll still have to go in here, and even though you can script it out, through the CI/CD pipeline, essentially you can't script out authorization, which is a pain in the rear, because essentially at the end of the day, someone in DevOps will still have to go into Azure Portal and click authorize. All right, so let's see. I think that solves it for questions. Like I said, if you ever need to contact me, here's my about me. I would love to talk. I can talk your ear off about logic apps and functions. So if you ever have a question, feel free to reach out to me. And I will also post this up on my GitHub account in a folder with some sample code.
Awesome, Chet. Thanks for giving this presentation. If you guys need to reach out to Chet or want to talk to him, you guys can definitely hang on. According to Chet's availability, obviously, but you guys can definitely hang on and talk to him. Otherwise, feel free to shoot him a message on Twitter, GitHub, Slack. I think the Chicago Code Slack channels is available on all of the formats. So once again, thanks, Chet.
All right, thanks so much, everyone.
See you guys at the next event.
All right, this line sounds pretty quiet, so hang on for another minute if anyone wants to PM me or anything.
Yeah, I like your demo with the Twitter thing. That was a good demo.
Thanks.
But that's a simple, easy, straight up presentation demo. So I'll say that's